Hi, everyone. I want to just briefly talk about civic engagement this morning, specifically looking at not only what we mean by civic engagement, but some of the reasons why we feel that civic engagement is declining, and of course, some of the barriers to civic engagement, or the conditions at least that can promote it. All right, so when we talk about civic engagement, we're talking about individual and collective actions that are designed to address and identify issues of public concern. Um, in 2000, an author named Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone, America's Declining Social Capital, that sort of brought the issue of civic engagement and some of the declines in civic engagement into the broader conversation. So the thesis of the book was essentially that the decline in social capital is caused by a decline in in-person interaction. Just so you're clear, social capital basically is a reference to the networks of relationships that are available to an individual, viewed mostly in terms of facilitating access to resources or opportunities. Here, though, it's mostly social capital. This use of social capital is meant to refer to those networks, specifically insofar as they facilitate community and civic engagement. So the argument that Putnam is making in his book is that social capital is declining, and the cause of the decline in social capital is a decline in in-person interaction. And he measured this decline in in-person interaction as a kind of aggregate loss of membership in voluntary civic organizations. So he looked at things like the Boy Scouts and the Elks and the Rotary Club and bowling leagues and things like that. And he said that, over the last, this was in 2000, but over the last uh, 30 or so years leading up to the publication of the book, membership in those organizations had been steadily declining. And the argument goes that as people don't interact anymore, it's much more difficult for them to form social capital. And of course, the argument, not made by Putnam, but made by other social scientists, is that a decline in social capital is going to have negative or deleterious effects on the degree to which people engage within their communities. So there are a lot of factors, some of them direct, some of them indirect, that are kind of associated with low engagement in these kind of network building sorts of environments. Broadly speaking, on a cultural level, and none of these things are either purely structural or purely cultural. Obviously, at this point, hopefully you understand that all of those are kind of interactional relationships, that culture and structure are kind of deeply intertwined. But on a more cultural side of the argument, a lot of people feel that higher levels of mistrust of government and civic society broadly, which is especially high, by the way, among minorities, for obvious historical reasons, right? The high level of mistrust of government among minorities is at the very least grounded in the experiences of these groups historically within the United States. But higher levels of mistrust of the state broadly and civic society broadly are obviously going to function to create disincentives for people to be engaged with those environments. There's also a strong correlation between socioeconomic status and other socioeconomic factors and low engagement. So you can imagine time constraints, right? To engage in voluntary organizations, one must have a little bit of disposable time. But economic um, as economic conditions for most people haven't really significantly improved since the 1970s, but you know lifestyle costs and housing costs and energy costs and things like that have continued to rise, um, more and more people spend more and more time pursuing, wages and salary. They work harder and they work longer, which leaves them with less time on their hands to engage in these things. That's kind of also correlated with a rise in dual earner households. Um, and again, the rise in dual earner households is a function of sort of stagnated wages and salaries. So the time constraints that are associated with employment demands leave people with less time to get, sort of engaged in these voluntary organizations and other ways of sort of integrating themselves into the broader community itself. There are also physical constraints, right? The physical constraints are kind of linked to both economic forces and geographic forces. So we've talked repeatedly over the course of the semester about declining residential density and atomization, right? As people have moved out of urban centers and into increasingly less dense, more sprawling communities outside of the urban core. It's harder to even define the boundaries of a community, let alone have places and spaces within those increasingly atomized communities that could serve as a center for people to come together and engage in the first place. Even as participation in things like youth sports has increased, it hasn't been sufficient to offset the kind of the dispersing and atomizing effects of suburban living. And this is very directly connected to a lack of what we call third places. Now, third places are social surroundings that are separate from the two usual social environments of home and work. There's a guy named Oldenburg. You read a selection from one of his publications called The Great Good Place, in which he talks about the problem of place in America. And one of the problems of place in America is that we really have this kind of two-mode or two-nodal kind of model for everyday life. We go from home to work and then from work to home. And um, the nature of work and the nature of home are not particularly conducive to the formation of social networks and social capital. They're not conducive to learning about your neighbors and the issues that are facing your community. And so we grow increasingly isolated from one another. And when we do reach out for social connection, it is increasingly to groups that are aligned around affinity-based criteria, right? Our friends are people who are like us. We listen to people who share our social and cultural and political views. We tend to gravitate toward people who share our socioeconomic status, right? So for a variety of reasons, we're living in worlds that are increasingly insular and bubble-like in terms of the perspectives and the viewpoints that are represented in these kind of attenuated or very, very limited social networks. So Oldenburg, who's been doing work in this area for quite a while, Oldenburg identifies some characteristics of third places. And don't worry, you don't need to know these for any kind of test, but I wanted to kind of run through the 8 characteristics of third places so that you can see the way in which places like pubs and bistros and cafes and libraries and even colleges and universities can kind of sometimes function as third places under the right set of circumstances. Fostering that sense of community, fostering environments where unlike people often kind of come together and build social networks, enrich social capital, decrease the sense of isolation and dissimilarity that hopefully would then lead to less difficulty in establishing kind of shared responses to social problems, right? How do we solve our problems? Well, the first thing we have to do is kind of agree on the nature of the problems, and that's gotten harder and harder to do over the years. So the 8 characteristics of third places, and I'll talk about them each kind of a little bit in turn, but you can see the way in which these are kind of, well, one of the characteristics is that these third places are leveling places, and you can see kind of what that means, and how these other things kind of facilitate that. So the first characteristic of a third place is that it has to be neutral ground. In other words, the occupants of third places have no obligation to be there, nor do they have any obligation to stay. They can kind of come and go as they please. And because it's not a coercive or obligatory environment, the orientation that people have toward that environment is going to be fundamentally different than like work, where you have to be at work, whether you want to be there or not. Third places are much more voluntary in that regard. As I said, they're leveling places. In other words, no importance is placed on an individual's status in the broader society. In these third places, everyone is essentially equal. Conversation, the third characteristic of a third place, is that playful and happy conversation is the main focus of activity. It's not the only thing that happens in third places, but it's an essential core element of what happens there, and value is placed on people's willingness and ability to participate in conversation. The fourth characteristic of third places is that they are open, and that means open in terms of accessibility and accommodation. So the third place must be found to be open and accessible and accommodating by the people who are using it, right? They have to feel, in essence, welcome in these places. Regulars, the fifth characteristic of a third place is that it's populated by regulars. Regulars set the tone and the kind of the mood for a third place. They help attract and welcome and orient newcomers to the third places, so that they can also be kind of folded in and given a sense of ownership and propriety over the third place. The sixth characteristic is that third places have a kind of low profile. The pressure of being in like a more formal environment is kind of antithetical to third places. These are never snobby. Third places are never snobby. They're never pretentious. They accept all types of people, and that has to be kind of a fundamental characteristic, right? That it can't be a welcoming environment if you feel like you're constantly kind of on, if you will. The seventh characteristic of a third place is the mood has to be playful. So the tone of conversation is never really marked with tension or hostility. It's not that people in third places don't engage in serious conversation and consequential interaction. It's that everyone understands that here, we're not having a fight, we're having a conversation, we're having an engaged sort of, back and forth, the banter, the wit and the banter and the humor that is necessary for those kinds of conversations is sort of front and center in a third place. And then the last, of course, is that a third place has to feel like a home away from home. Occupants need to feel a home-like warmth, a home-like sense of belonging and ownership. Because it is their place. As much as it's everybody else's place, it's also their place. I've done a lot of work in London. I've spent a lot of time in pubs, and I find them to be a really, really kind of nice example. Some better than others, but most of them, generally speaking, are really good examples of third places. And it's appropriate, right? Because pub is actually short for public house, and nobody calls it a public house anymore, but when you do a little bit of unraveling, you see that the purpose of these places was to give people a kind of home away from home, a sense of, we are all equals in this community. We are all, permitted and welcome to be in this space, and we are a community. And as a result of that, right, people in communities and people in societies that are characterized by third places tend to have higher levels of civic engagement. They tend to have higher levels of broad awareness of social issues and social problems. They're much more likely to be able to orient, or to create or foster the kind of shared sense of purpose that is necessary to solve certain social problems. So when you think about, like, all of the problems facing the United States, and not just the United States but other societies, of course we're focusing on the U.S. When you look at those problems and they feel insurmountable, they feel like, we see the problems but we don't really know where to start. Part of the reason why people have that sense of um, that lack of direction is that there's no sense of how you would kind of form a movement, right? One of the first things you need to do to form a social movement is to find other people who want to create the changes that you want to see happen as well. And when there are fewer places in which that can happen, um, the barriers to being able to generate effective social movements to solve social problems really begins to decline. So, I think that the solution to to the absence or the limited number of third places in American society isn't going to be an easy problem to solve. But I think that any broad approach to solving social problems is going to have to involve the deliberate and intentional efforts to create third places and to create places for social, for the development of networks, which would lead to social capital, which allows for a greater degree of civic engagement. So keep that in mind as as you finish up with college and you move out into your own communities. That becomes really, really important to keep in the back of your mind as a necessary condition. It's not sufficient, but it's a necessary condition to kind of build a more engaged public, and an engaged public is going to be much more likely to solve its collective problems than one that's atomized and disconnected from one another. All right, so that wraps up this. Of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out via email, jump into the discussion boards, let me know, and I will be happy to clarify any of this. So until next time, I'll say take care.